And so but these were Lutheran pietists who had chosen to stay within Lutheranism. What this meant was they had a fairly broad view of the Christian community. They believed in a folk church. In other words, they believed in an ethnically based or a geographically based Lutheranism that was not a gathered church. It was not exclusive. You weren't separating the sheep from the goats. What they tried to do is within this sort of folk church, and in some respects it was an impossible task. They tried to warm the spiritual temperature of the entire church by education and edification in that sense. I mean, think of where we are now in Mount Carmel. That was Mount Carmel Lutheran Bible Institute. That was the major purpose. They weren't separating themselves off. They weren't separatists. They existed for the larger good of the whole. They held to the centrality of justification, but also we're wrestling with the place of sanctification in Lutheran theology, and don't boo me when I say sanctification. Okay, they had a distrust of formalism in both worship and theology. They were sacramental, but not rigidly so. They had a stress on living lives of personal moral integrity. They believed in the sharing of the gospel as the duty of all individuals. And for them, the Bible was a central living narrative. In other words, the Bible was the narrative that they viewed their life through the biblical lens. And so, metaphors and similes and images of the Bible applied to their lives in a sort of a realistic way. Structure. So that's theology. Structure. We sometimes don't give enough credit to how the structure of American religion shapes religion in this country in profound ways. We are so used to voluntary religion. In other words, you can be whatever religion you want and you don't have to be any religion at all. We're so used to this voluntary, pluralistic American religion that it is almost second nature to us. But the sense especially when the Lutherans were coming over, when almost anybody comes over to the United States, how incredibly different America is religiously from any other country in the world. The most recent immigrants are wrestling with the same kind of factors that American Lutherans wrestled with 250 or 150 or 50 years ago, in that sense. What it means is if you want religion, you are perfectly free to set up any particular kind of religion you want, but you have to pay for it and run it yourself. Now think how strange that is for essentially state church Lutherans coming over from a homogeneous European situation. What this has meant for immigrant groups from 1620 to 2010 is a number of interesting things. First of all, they have to justify themselves. Why should we bother to set up religion in this country? Why should we bother to replicate Lutheranism here? We're in the United States. Why don't we become Congregationalists or Episcopalians? They have to sort of, and then what kind of Lutheranism are we going to be? The state church Lutheranism is pretty broad. There's a range there's a place in state church Lutheranism in Europe for a lot of little cells in between, So what kind of, are we going to replicate? Are we going to have bishops? Are we going to, are we going to be pietists? Are we going to be confessionalists? Or what are we going to do? All right. And then, of course, this this Christian world that they came into was dominated by Reformed or Calvinist Protestantism, and then by its 2.0 version of American revivalist evangelicalism. Okay. The churchly pietism that mainly the leaders of American Lutheranism brought over dovetailed in part with this dominant paradigm without being able to sort of totally fit into it. In other words, there were lots of points of contact between this churchly pietism and the American revivalism or American evangelicalism. And American Lutherans adopted from the Reformed and from the Presbyterians a form of synodical polity, which was between Episcopalianism or episcopacy and Congregationalism. I loved it. One guy who had got knocked around in the synodical wars in the late 19th century came out with the definition that the true definition of synod, you've learned this all, right? The synod is from the Greek meaning to walk together. This guy said, real meaning of synod is synods are nothing more than organized sin. Synods, organized sin. Well, if you take a certain Lutheran anthropology, an understanding of the human person, it's pretty close, right? But what this meant was that they would organize congregations. And then they would that congregations would band together and submit themselves voluntarily to a larger authority in which they would have some representation. In other words, this is people who trace back the roots of modern democracy go back to Calvin's Geneva and to Holland and other sorts of places as one of the roots of this sort of modern democracy. The idea that people get together in local units, they send representatives to regional, governing agencies, kinds of things like this. This is all pretty clear in this sense. All right. So the congregations banded together to do what they could not do separately. They voluntarily submitted, and they said, as long as we're in the synod, we will go with the will of what is what the synod itself as a whole elective body decides to do. All right. Now, for the first 175 years, well, let's put it this way: for the first 100 years in American Lutheranism, there weren't even any synods. All right. For the first 175 years or so of American Lutheranism, there weren't any national structures. In other words, all that there was a handful of regional synods: New York, Pennsylvania, the Carolinas, Virginia, places like that. And so, even when they began in the 19th century to put together when they put together national structures, the national structures were fairly weak. The national structures were literally federations of synods. It was a federative model, and I'll come back to this.